The sound of crystal shattering against marble echoed through the silent dinner. In that instant, Clara Morrison understood that her 25-year marriage had ended, not with tears, but with a signature she almost placed on a document of betrayal. Boston was freezing that night. The golden light of the upscale restaurant spilled across a long table draped in white linen, and at its center stood a bottle of Bordeaux that Richard, her husband, had just opened as part of his usual ritual. "It's just tax paperwork, Clara," he said softly, his tone warm as always. "I just need your signature before dinner to save time." He slid the folder toward her, wearing that same charming smile that graced the pages of financial magazines. Clara picked up the pen. The candlelight flickered in her eyes, and in that moment the final line caught her attention. "Transfer of all joint assets valued at $48 million to Lena Cross." A silent stab. The blood drained from her face. Her hand froze. Her heart pounding in her chest, each beat merging with the faint piano melody in the background, Claire de Lune, suddenly cruel in its elegance. She looked up. Richard was still smiling, arrogance glinting behind his gentle facade. The light reflected in his eyes made them look hollow like glass. Clara quietly set the pen down, tucked the paper beneath the others, and said in a calm, unnervingly steady voice, "You're so thoughtful. I'll go over it tonight when we're home, all right." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. I just want you to feel secure." Secure. The word echoed in Clara's mind all the way home. Their luxurious penthouse overlooking the Charles River was still lit, but to her it now looked like a gilded cage. On the wall hung their wedding photo from Capri, Richard holding her hand, smiling radiantly. Back then he'd called her the keeper of the fire in his life. Now that same fire was burning out inside her. Standing before the mirror, Clara removed the necklace Richard had given her for their 20th anniversary. The metal felt cold against her skin. In the reflection, a 42-year-old woman with dark hair and haunted eyes stared back, no longer the proud wife of a powerful businessman, but a woman deceived for years. She remembered the late nights, the strange perfume on his shirts, the phone calls behind closed doors. All of it now formed a complete picture. The betrayer, the mistress, and the transfer of $48 million. Her phone buzzed. A message appeared from Ethan, her son. "Mom, I'll be at the office late. Everything okay?" Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her heart softening. Ethan, her only child, a young lawyer of integrity, was the one good thing left in her world. She typed back, "I'm fine, just a little tired," then deleted it before sending. No, she couldn't tell him. Not yet. Outside the window, the winter wind howled, blowing a stray invoice off the desk. Under the desk lamp, Clara noticed her old savings book, the personal account Richard had once dismissed as just a small fund. She opened the faded pages, memories flooding back long nights spent balancing books, helping her husband through financial crises, the projects she'd helped plan but never been credited for. He had always said, "We're a team, Clara." Now she understood that team had only one winner. She rose, walked to the safe, and took out a small USB wrapped in silk. Inside was a copy of every financial record she had ever managed: Cayman accounts, real estate funds, undeclared profits. Richard thought she was a docile wife who knew nothing about money. He'd forgotten that she was once the strategic advisor who helped him build his empire, and he certainly didn't know that Clara had been quietly saving evidence for years. That night, she called an old contact, Alan Pierce, a forensic accountant who had worked with them when the company first started. "I need you to look into a name," she said, her voice low and even. "Lena Cross." There was a pause on the other end before Alan replied, "I'll check, but Clara, Are you sure you want to open Pandora's box again? That box doesn't have a lid anymore, she said and hung up. Around 3 in the morning, she was still sitting by the window watching the distant lights of the night ferries drifting along the river. Inside, her fear was fading, replaced by something colder, sharper, gleaming like a blade. Clara knew that if she wanted to survive, she would have to enter Richard's game, but not to plead to win. The next morning, Richard left early, saying he had a shareholders' meeting. She watched his reflection in the glass as he walked away, still carrying himself with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled everything. When the elevator doors closed, Clara turned back inside, picked up the phone, and called Ethan. "Honey, I'd like to see you tonight. Just the two of us." Her voice was soft, but in her eyes flickered a light Richard had never seen in 25 years of marriage. When Ethan agreed, Clara smiled. Outside, the Charles River flowed quietly, but inside the storm had already begun. The sky over Boston was a dull shade of gray, with misty rain drifting across the glass windows. Clara stood before the large window of her penthouse, holding a steaming cup of jasmine tea, her eyes empty. From here she could see the familiar streets where she and Richard had once built their empire, but now they felt distant and cold, as if she were looking at another city entirely. The door opened. Richard walked in his coat, still damp from the rain. He smiled lightly, the calm confidence of a man used to controlling the world. "The market was insane today," he said casually. "Good thing Lena managed the cash flow." Clara set her cup down gently. "Lena." She repeated, her voice low and even. "She's doing well, isn't she, Richard?" Chuckled a smug, self-satisfied sound. "Are you jealous? You know she's just a financial advisor. Advisor to whom, Richard? To you or to us?" He was silent for a moment, then replied slowly. "Clara, I'm protecting our future. Don't make this into something it's not." She gave a faint smile, her eyes calm as a still lake. "Our future," she said softly. "You do have a way with words." Then she turned away, hiding the fire beneath her composure, the kind of anger that burns quietly under a wet cloth. When Richard went upstairs to his office, Clara sat down at her desk and opened her personal laptop, the one he had never bothered to notice. With a few clicks, dozens of emails appeared on the screen. Large wire transfers had been made to Cross Holdings, LLC. The name made her chest tighten. Lena Cross. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. It was Alan Pierce, the accountant who had once worked for her family. "Clara, I checked," he said in a low voice. "That account is under Lena Cross's name. She's the direct beneficiary, and it's worse than that. There's a contract waiting for your signature. If you sign it, you'll lose every ownership right you have. How much time do I have?" "Not much. Maybe a few days." She hung up her pulse, pounding in her ears. On the wall was their old wedding photo, Richard holding her hand, smiling brightly under the Italian sun. Back then, he had called her the woman of reason and faith. Now that same faith had become the weapon he used to stab her heart. Late at night, Ethan came home. Her son, a young lawyer who had just joined a prestigious firm, still carried the clear, steady eyes of someone who believed in justice. "Mom, you look tired," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the rain. I just wanted to ask you something about property law." Ethan looked surprised. "What kind of question?" "If a wife is asked to sign a contract she doesn't fully understand what happens, then if there's coercion or deceit, that contract is void." "But why are you asking?" Clara gave a small, distant smile. "Just curious. Your father always says, I don't understand the law." Ethan frowned slightly, sensing something beneath her tone. "Mom, if something's wrong, don't hide it from me." "It's nothing, sweetheart," she said softly, walking him to the door. When it closed behind him, her smile disappeared. Clara sat down, inhaling deeply, as her thoughts aligned like chess pieces across a silent board. In this game, she had once been the one deceived. Now she would make the first move. Night fell. Richard wasn't home yet. The vast apartment was quiet. She walked into his office, the room he had forbidden her to enter. The air smelled of old wine walnut wood and a faint trace of unfamiliar perfume. On the desk lay a thick envelope labeled Emergency Transfer Protocol. She opened it. Inside was the same document, the transfer of their entire joint estate, $48 million to Lena Cross. The last line waited for her signature. Clara didn't cry. She simply stood still, staring at the words of betrayal. The desk lamp casting sharp light on the black ink that gleamed like a blade. A chill ran down her spine, but instead of fear, a rare clarity filled her chest. She understood now this wasn't marriage anymore, it was war. She folded the document carefully and put it back in its place. Then she took another sheet of paper and began to write, Aurora Foundation Irrevocable Living Trust. Beneath it, she filled in the name of the trustee, Ethan Morrison. Each letter was firm, etched like metal. The sound of the elevator echoed through the penthouse. Richard was home. He walked into the living room, tired but still carrying that air of confidence. "You're still up?" he asked. "I thought you'd be asleep." "Couldn't sleep," she replied softly. "Tell me, Richard, have you ever thought about what would happen to all this if I suddenly disappeared?" He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing," she said lightly, tilting her head with a faint, unreadable smile. "Just a question." Richard studied her for a moment, then walked away. When the bedroom door closed behind him, Clara opened her laptop again and composed a short email to an independent lawyer she had worked with years ago. "I need to protect my assets before I'm betrayed." She turned off the light. Outside, the rain poured harder, city lights blurring like an open wound that refused to heal. In the darkness, Clara whispered to herself, "Did you really think I'd sit still, Richard?" In the distance, thunder rolled long and deep like the opening note of a coming battle. Inside, her fear had died, leaving only cold determination. She was no longer the deceived wife. She was the one who would rewrite the rules. Morning in Boston was wrapped in a thin veil of fog, pale sunlight spreading across the surface of the Charles River. Clara sat at her small desk, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She hadn't slept all night, but there was no exhaustion left in her eyes, only the calm coldness of someone who had stopped being afraid. An email arrived from the lawyer she had contacted the night before. "We can establish an irrevocable trust. I'll need your asset list certificates and the name of a trustee you trust completely." The last sentence made her pause. The only person she still trusted was Ethan. She called her son. His voice was warm and carefree as always. "Mom, you're calling so early. Is everything okay? I just wanted to ask if I needed you to sign some legal papers. Would you help me? Whenever you need me?" "I'm here," he said without hesitation. The answer made Clara's throat tighten. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered. After the call, she opened her financial files. With a few keystrokes, Clara calculated the total value of her holdings company, Shares Real Estate, and more than a dozen separate accounts. She would transfer everything into the Aurora Foundation, a trust with Ethan as the legal guardian. Once activated, Richard wouldn't be able to touch a single cent. Around noon, Alan Pierce called. "I found more documents. You should see them." In his small office, Clara held a thick stack of papers filled with records of international transfers, over $8 million, sent to an account under the name Cross Holdings, LLC. The signature of approval, Lena Cross. Alan looked at her worried. "What are you going to do?" Clara smiled faintly. "I'm not going to fight," she said. "I'm just taking back what I built." That evening, Richard unexpectedly invited her to dinner with some business partners. He hadn't wanted her to appear in public for years. Clara understood immediately this wasn't an invitation, it was a test. Of course, she replied, "I'll go." The restaurant by the harbor glowed with golden light. Clara walked in wearing a dark blue velvet dress, her confident posture drawing every gaze in the room. Richard gave her a polished smile, but his eyes couldn't hide the surprise. "You look stunning." Beside him stood Lena Redlips, proud eyes, a voice sweet as syrup. "So nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Morrison," Clara replied calmly. "Likewise." The dinner was loud, filled with talk of financial strategies and asset restructuring. From time to time, Lena brushed her hand against Richard's arm, and he laughed in that self-satisfied way she knew too well. Clara stayed quiet, her lips pressed together, a small recording device hidden beneath her delicate necklace, capturing every word. When dessert arrived, Richard placed an envelope in front of her. "Just temporary authorization papers for accounting. Lena will be handling the assets for a few weeks." His tone was smooth, but his eyes searched hers. Clara looked directly at him. "You want me to sign this here in the middle of dinner? I trust you," he said. "I hope you trust me." She smiled faintly. "I trust you, but I'm not stupid." The table went silent. Lena forced a laugh while Richard's knuckles turned white around his wine glass. "You're embarrassing me, Clara. I just want to make sure you're not about to leave me with nothing." After dinner, Richard pulled her aside into the hallway, his voice low and sharp. "What are you trying to do? Make me look bad in front of my partners." She met his eyes, her voice cold as steel. "I want you to remember that the woman you underestimated still has a brain." Then she walked away, leaving him standing alone beneath the glittering lights, empty-handed and furious. That night, Clara returned to the apartment, slipped off her heels, and sat at her desk. Her computer screen glowed, displaying an email confirmation from the lawyer the Aurora Foundation has been preliminarily approved. Asset transfer must be completed within 2 days. She took a deep breath and wrote on a notepad, "Tomorrow transfer company shares. The day after, activate trust." Outside, the wind was rising, the rain had stopped, and the city shimmered under the streetlights like a giant mirror. Clara looked at her reflection in the window, not the image of a betrayed wife, but of a woman reclaiming her power. She whispered softly, "You forgot who I was, Richard. But soon you'll remember." Then she turned off the light and let the darkness wrap around her calm heart, the kind of stillness that comes right before the storm. Boston was cloaked in a smoky gray sky. Clara woke early, not out of habit, but because sleep would not come. The clock struck 6 softly, and she was already seated at her desk, the financial papers neatly stacked before her. Every number, every signature was a fragment of 25 years of marriage, now turned into evidence of betrayal. She called Alan Pierce. "I want to transfer my entire personal investment portfolio today. Use the system only you and I can access." Alan was silent for a moment before replying quietly, "Are you sure you're ready for this, Clara? Once you do it, there's no going back. That's exactly why I'm doing it," she said, her voice steady and firm. When the clock struck 8, the computer screen flashed a message. "Transfer completed, Aurora Foundation." A thin red line crossed the spreadsheet, showing that nearly $32 million were now beyond Richard Morrison's reach. She leaned back in her chair, feeling not relief, but an empty stillness. The numbers were cold, yet they carried the shape of freedom. The doorbell rang. It was Ethan. He wore a gray shirt and carried his laptop. "Mom, you said you needed me to sign something." Clara invited him in and poured him a cup of coffee. Yes, just a financial formality. I'm setting up a small charitable foundation and I need you listed as the trustee. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A charity? Since when are you doing that? She smiled gently. Since yesterday. You know, sometimes people have to create something new when the old things start to fall apart. Ethan looked at his mother as if wanting to ask more, but her calm expression stopped him. He signed still, believing this was just another philanthropic project. When the pen left the paper, Clara said softly, "You've just helped me protect my entire life." After Ethan left, she stood by the window watching her son disappear down the street. A quiet ache filled her heart, a mix of love and fear. He had no idea his mother had just pulled their family away from the blade of a traitor. At noon, Richard came home earlier than usual, carrying his practiced smile and a bouquet of red roses, the kind he used whenever he wanted to smother suspicion. "I think we should make peace, Clara," he said smoothly. "I'm flying to Miami this week for a few days, and I need you to sign a few papers to make the transactions easier." She looked at him, her expression calm. "More papers? You seem to like having me sign things lately." Richard sat across from her, taking her hand. "I know you've been stressed, but this is all to protect our joint assets." She smiled faintly and pulled her hand away. "If they're ours, you shouldn't have to hide anything from me. But if they're yours, don't ask me to sign." The smile on Richard's lips faltered, and for a brief moment his eyes flashed with caution. "You're talking like I'm some kind of con artist." Clara stood and walked to the kitchen counter to pour herself a glass of water. "I didn't say that. I just think if you're so afraid of me understanding too much, maybe I should learn how to read contracts again." Richard was silent, then shrugged his voice, turning cold. "Suit yourself, but don't forget everything here is in my name." "And you should remember," she replied, "a name is just ink on paper, not ownership." When he went upstairs, Clara picked up her phone and called Alan. "Complete the second phase of the transfer. I'll go to the notary's office tomorrow." Alan sighed. "Do you want me to alert your private lawyer?" "Not yet. Everything must stay completely silent." That afternoon, she sat in the living room turning on the TV only to drown out the sound of the wind. A financial news segment was on. Richard appeared on screen, smiling confidently as he spoke about a new residential project. The man in the blue suit looked successful, powerful, admirable. No one watching could imagine that behind that face was betrayal, written in every signature, every transfer. Clara watched him and realized she had loved an illusion for half her life. Dusk settled in when her phone buzzed with a message. "I need you to sign the tax papers before I leave. Don't worry, it's nothing important." She didn't respond. Instead, she opened the safe and took out the hard drive containing all the financial data she had copied over time. Each file was encrypted and named after memories only she would understand. Capri 19999, the first deal, Truth 2023. She looked at them as if looking back at her own life from the joyful beginnings to the moment of betrayal. All of it would now become her tools, her weapons, her proof. Night fell. The city glowed like a sea of light. Clara opened the window and the cold wind rushed in, scattering the papers on her desk. One sheet fluttered to the floor, landing face up, showing the words, "Aurora Foundation Irrevocable Living Trust." She bent down, picked it up, and smiled wearily. Tomorrow, everything would belong to the trust. And when Richard signed the document he thought would erase her name, he would finally realize Clara Morrison had been one step ahead all along. She closed the window and turned off the lights, leaving the room in quiet darkness. But within her, another kind of light was rising, the light of willpower, of a woman finally awakening from the illusion once called love. Autumn had arrived, and the trees in front of the building shed their golden leaves. Clara left the notary's office with slow but steady steps. In her handbag was the original certificate confirming that the Aurora Foundation had been officially activated. Every asset she owned now belonged to the trust, untouchable and irrevocable. From this moment on, Richard Morrison no longer had the right to access a single dollar. The cold wind slipped through her collar, yet Clara felt warm. It wasn't victory she felt, but the quiet peace of someone who was finally free. That evening, Ethan stopped by with a box of pastries. "Mom, what's got you smiling like that? I haven't seen you this happy in ages." Clara slipped the certificate into a drawer and smiled. "Maybe because I finally did what needed to be done." Ethan sat down and opened the box. "I still worry about you. Are you and Dad okay?" She looked at her son, a trace of sadness crossing her smile. "There are things that don't need to be said, only understood at the right time. I just want you to always stay true to yourself and never let anyone take away your trust." Ethan nodded, sensing her meaning, but choosing not to ask further. When he left, Clara stood alone in the quiet room. Her reflection in the glass looked fragile, yet unshakable. She knew the time for confrontation was coming. Richard would soon realize that the money had disappeared, and when he did, she had to be ready. 3 days later, Richard came home earlier than usual. The door swung open hard, his footsteps heavy across the marble floor. He threw his briefcase onto the couch, his face pale with fury. "Clara, what the hell is going on with the company accounts?" he roared. "Half the portfolio is frozen and the bank says they can't verify ownership." Clara calmly poured herself a cup of tea. "Perhaps you should ask your accountant. I haven't handled financial matters in years." "Don't play dumb," Richard growled. "I know you touched the accounts. Who helped you?" "Was it Alan?" She looked up, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Are you afraid, Richard?" The air thickened between them. He stared at her, his eyes dark with suspicion and anger. "You think you're smarter than me? Everything you have came from me." "No," she said softly but firmly. "Everything you have came from me." Richard gave a short, dry laugh. "Don't delude yourself, Clara. I built this empire." "Really?" She tilted her head. "Then tell me who wrote the first proposal, who convinced the bank to invest when you had nothing but a dream. Did you forget that her words struck him like a slap?" For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty. Then it vanished. "You should watch what you say." He warned, his tone low. "If you keep defying me, you'll regret it." Clara rose to her feet, meeting his glare without flinching. "You've made me regret it for 25 years, Richard. Now it's your turn." He stormed off, slamming the door so hard the picture frames on the wall trembled. She stood still, her heart pounding, but there was no fear left in her. The real storm had begun, but this time she held the one thing he couldn't take away control. That night, Clara received a call from Alan. "He's had someone following me. I think he's suspicious." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, but you should be careful. Richard might do something reckless." She answered quietly. "I've lived under his fear for years. Not anymore." After hanging up, she sat before the mirror. The light reflected the face of a woman in her 50s, faint lines tracing around her eyes, yet her gaze was clearer than ever. She remembered the early years of their marriage when she believed love and trust could keep a man loyal. Now she understood, in Richard's world, love was an investment, and trust was something he bought with promises. She opened the safe, took out a backup hard drive, and slipped it into her bag. A second plan was ready. If Richard tried to strike back, she would let the world see who he really was. The next morning, the financial world erupted with news. Morrison Capital was under investigation for fraud, and its stock was plummeting. Richard appeared on television, his face tight as he denied the allegations. Clara turned off the TV, took a sip of tea, and felt an odd sense of calm. The phone rang. It was Richard. "Clara, what have you done? Are you trying to destroy me?" "No," she said softly. "I'm just reclaiming what's mine. If you feel like you've lost something, maybe it's because you forgot who helped you build it. You'll pay for this," he shouted. Maybe she replied, "But I'll pay with freedom. And you'll pay with everything." She hung up and closed her eyes. Outside, the autumn wind swept through the trees, carrying the scent of wet leaves and river mist. Inside Clara's heart, fear had turned to steel. The final battle hadn't come yet, but she was ready. The morning news spread through Boston like an autumn wind. Morrison Capital under investigation for financial fraud. On the large television screen in the living room, Richard appeared in his usual tailored suit, his lips pressed into a confident smile as he told reporters, "This is just a minor misunderstanding. Our company operates with full transparency." Clara turned off the TV. The room fell into silence. Outside, golden leaves swirled in the breeze. She knew Richard was striking back, and his first weapon would be defamation. That afternoon, his secretary delivered an official summons to Ethan requesting that he testify in court for an asset falsification investigation. The name listed as the accused was his mother. Ethan froze his hands, trembling as he opened the envelope. He went home, his face pale and confused. "Mom, Dad says you transferred funds illegally. They want me to testify next week." Clara looked at her son, her voice calm, though her eyes carried sorrow. "You don't need to defend anyone. Just tell the truth." Ethan was silent. Inside him, two images battled his powerful father and his gentle but mysterious mother. At last, he nodded softly. "I won't betray you, Mom." But Richard didn't stop there. He hired a media firm to spread rumors that Clara had embezzled charitable funds and paid private investigators to dig for proof of her so-called financial affair. Within hours, smaller tabloids began publishing suggestive headlines, "The Scheming Wife" and "Her Mysterious Trust Fund." In just a few hours, Clara's reputation was torn apart. Alan Pierce called his voice low. "They're twisting the story. I've backed up all the data to 3 separate drives. One has already been sent to your lawyer." Clara quietly thanked him. She was no longer afraid, only resolute. Ethan received a call from Richard. "Son, all you need to do is confirm that your mother signed the wrong papers, and this will all be over. I'll even give you a position at the company." Ethan was stunned. "You want me to lie?" Richard replied smoothly, "I want you to save this family." But Ethan knew what his father really wanted to save was his own reputation. "I'll tell the truth," he said, his voice shaking but firm, then hung up. Clara knew Richard wouldn't relent. Together with her lawyer, she filed a counterclaim copies of the Aurora Foundation Trust, notarized documents, verified bank transfers, and a recording of a call between Richard and Lena, where Lena's voice said clearly, "Everything will be ours once she signs." Hearing the recording again made Clara's chest tighten. Richard's voice was steady, emotionless, like a man discussing an investment, not a betrayal. "We have enough evidence," her lawyer said. "Do you want to make it public?" "Not yet," Clara replied. "I want him to see it for himself." 2 days before the hearing, Richard appeared at her door. For the first time in years, he wasn't wearing a suit. His hair was messy, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "What are you doing, Clara? Do you want to destroy everything?" She met his eyes. "No, I'm keeping what's mine. You can't beat me. You lost the moment you started lying." Richard's face hardened. Then he turned and stormed out, the sound of the slamming door echoing through the apartment. Clara remained still, her heart pounding, but there was no fear left. The storm had truly begun, but this time she held the power he could never touch control. That night, Alan called again. "He's having me followed. I think he suspects everything. Are you okay? I'm fine, but be careful. Richard might do something reckless." Clara answered softly, "I've lived in his shadow of fear for years. Not anymore." After the call, she sat before the mirror. The light reflected the face of a woman in her 50s, faint lines framing her eyes, but her gaze was brighter than ever. She thought back to the early years of her marriage when she had believed love and trust were enough to keep a man faithful. Now she understood in Richard's world, love was an investment, and trust was something he bought with promises. She opened the safe, took out a backup hard drive, and placed it in her bag. A second plan was ready. If Richard struck back, the world would finally see who he truly was. The next morning, financial headlines exploded. Morrison Capital faces fraud allegations, shares plummet. Richard appeared on television again, his face drawn, trying to deny the accusations. Clara switched off the screen, took a slow sip of tea, and felt a strange calm settle over her. The phone rang. It was Richard. "Clara, what have you done? Are you trying to destroy me?" "No," she said softly. "I'm just taking back what's mine." If you feel like you've lost something, maybe it's because you forgot who helped you build it. "You'll pay for this," he shouted. Maybe she replied, "But I'll pay with freedom, and you'll pay with everything." She hung up and closed her eyes. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wet leaves and river mist. Inside Clara's heart, fear had turned into steel. The final battle hadn't yet begun, but she was ready. That morning, the sky over Boston was thick with fog. In front of the federal courthouse, reporters crowded the entrance cameras, flashing toward the row of luxury cars parked along the curb. Clara stepped out of a taxi, wearing a pale beige suit, her hair neatly tied back. Her face was free of heavy makeup, yet there was an air of unshakable calm about her. Ethan walked beside her, gripping a leather briefcase tightly in his hand. As the courthouse door swung open, flashes erupted. Someone shouted, "Mrs. Morrison, is it true you created a trust to steal your husband's assets?" Clara didn't respond. She only smiled faintly, her gaze fixed straight ahead. On the steps, Richard stood waiting with his team of lawyers, tall and composed, though his expression was tense. When he saw his wife and son approaching, he hesitated for a moment before forcing a confident smile for the cameras. Inside, the hearing began under bright lights, the air filled with the scent of fresh paper and the quiet scrape of pens. Richard's attorney opened first. "My client was deceived by his former wife, who transferred joint assets into a fraudulent trust. We have reason to believe this was a deliberate act of financial misconduct." He placed a thick folder on the table. Clara's attorney, Miss Stern, stood to reply. "Our side not only possesses official documentation proving the Aurora Foundation was established legally, but also bank records and notarized papers dated 6 months before Mr. Morrison illegally transferred funds offshore. These will all be presented in due course." Her tone was calm but carried authority. Richard glanced toward Clara, waiting for her to tremble or look away, but she sat upright, eyes steady on the judge. When invited to speak, Clara approached the stand, her voice clear and composed. "I did not move assets to steal them. I moved them to protect what was rightfully mine after discovering deceit. I never wanted anyone to be hurt, but the truth deserves to be told." The courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. Then Richard's lawyer gave a short laugh. "Mrs. Morrison, do you have proof of these claims?" Clara nodded. Yes, and not just one piece. Mrs. Stern gestured to Ethan. He stepped forward, opening his briefcase and laying out a hard drive, a stack of papers, and a sealed envelope. These are transaction records my mother saved before she was asked to sign the transfer documents. They include payments sent to an account under the name Cross Holdings, LLC, managed by Miss Lena Cross. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Richard's face changed, though he tried to appear composed. That's a business associate, not a personal matter, he snapped. Ms. Stern gave a faint smile. Unfortunately, Mr. Morrison, your associate, told a different story. She opened a laptop and played an audio recording of a woman's voice, Lena's. Richard said once she signs, everything will be ours. I've already prepared a private account. The sound echoed through the courtroom, heavy and undeniable. Richard shot to his feet. That's fake, he shouted. The judge struck the gavel sharply. Order in the court. Ethan looked at his father, his eyes filled with both pain and disbelief. Dad, stop this, he said quietly. But Richard didn't hear him. He turned toward Clara, his tone dripping with disdain. You've always been good at playing the victim. Do you really think a few files will save you? Clara's gaze was steady. I don't need to save myself. I just want our son to know who's been lying. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Ethan's hands tightened his eyes, glistening as he struggled to hold back tears. He had once idolized his successful father, but now before the public, that polished image was cracking apart. The hearing lasted until late afternoon. When the judge called a recess to verify the evidence, reporters flooded the halls. Richard hurried to escape the flashing lights, but Clara didn't avoid them. A journalist asked Mrs. Morrison, "How do you feel about your ex-husband denying everything?" Clara replied calmly, "I didn't come here to argue. I came here to tell the truth." As the car carrying Clara and Ethan pulled away from the courthouse, silence filled the space between them. Finally, Ethan said softly, "I never imagined it would be like this." Clara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The truth may come late, but it never disappears. That night, she received an anonymous message, "Stop now if you don't want to lose everything." Clara read it, then deleted it without hesitation. She knew it came from one of Richard's people, but there was nothing left to fear. Outside the city of Boston shimmered under the evening lights, and within her another light had ignited the light of justice, the quiet strength of courage. Clara Morrison knew the battle wasn't over yet, but now the scales had begun to tip toward the truth. The next morning, Boston was drenched in cold rain. Clara opened her eyes after a sleepless night. Her phone rang nonstop, the screen flashing with unknown numbers, reporters, journalists, and opportunists eager to dig into the scandal. She turned the ringer off and let the noise of the world fade away. Inside her, there was only the eerie calm that comes before a storm. Ethan entered his shirt still damp from the rain. Mom, Dad just held a press conference. He said you edited the recording, that this is all someone else's conspiracy. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. He's always known how to make himself the victim. Ethan frowned. I'm afraid the public will believe him. People always believe the one with money. Clara turned toward the window. Don't worry. Money can buy silence, but it can't buy the truth. She poured herself a cup of tea, her voice calm but firm. Just stay by my side, Ethan. Don't say anything, don't react. Everything is moving the way it should. That afternoon, she met with Ms. Stern and Alan in her private office. On the table lay a new stack of files. We found the final transfer trail, Alan said. Richard withdrew $12 million from the project fund and moved it into a shell company in Switzerland under Lena's name. It all happened 3 months before he asked you to sign the contract. Stern nodded, her eyes sharp. If we release this, it becomes criminal evidence. Clara was silent for a moment, then said, "Release it. I've been silent long enough." That evening, the nightly financial news aired an exclusive report. Internal source exposes shady transactions at Morrison Capital. Screens showed transfer records, account numbers to transaction dates, and Richard's signature clear as day. Alongside them played a recording of Lena's voice saying, "He told me to follow the plan. Everything's already arranged." Watching from his office, Richard dropped his glass, the sound of shattering filling the room. He shouted, threw his phone, then called his lawyer. "Stop the broadcast. I'll sue every one of them." But it was too late. The evidence spread across every news outlet and social media feed. At the same time, Clara's phone filled with messages of support. People who had once admired the perfect couple were now standing with her. Women, lawyers, even former investors wrote, "You've done what most of us could only dream of." Ethan sat beside his mother, watching the flood of headlines on the screen. "Mom, I think people are starting to understand." Clara smiled softly. "I don't need them to understand, only to see the truth." But victory was short-lived. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Clara Morrison, a detective, asked politely, "We need you to come with us to clarify some details in the financial investigation." Ethan jumped up. "You have no right to arrest my mother." "We just need questioning," the officer replied. "This comes from the prosecutor's office." Clara placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "It's all right, Ethan. This is just the next part of the game." She calmly put on her coat and grabbed her bag. "They want to intimidate me, but they forget I was the one who used to write this company's contracts." At the police station, she sat beneath a bright light, her bare face illuminated. "Mrs. Morrison, the prosecutor, began. Do you admit to transferring company funds without authorization?" "No," she answered evenly. "I transferred my personal assets, which I fully own. Everything is documented with bank confirmation and notarization. Would you like to see it?" She reached into her bag and produced neatly arranged copies. The prosecutor fell silent at the sight of the red court seals and Ms. Stern's signature. "I simply protected my legal property from embezzlement," Clara continued. "If necessary, I can provide the original records of the transfers my husband tried to conceal." The questioning ended sooner than they expected. Outside, Allen and Stern were waiting. Stern spoke quietly. "It's just been reported Lena's gone missing. The Swiss account has been emptied. Richard is panicking." Clara nodded, slightly unsurprised. "She's only doing what he taught her to betray at the right time." That night, Richard called Clara. His voice was hoarse, tinged with defeat. "You've won, haven't you? What more do you want?" Clara's voice was calm, each word heavy as stone. "I never wanted to win. I just wanted you to see what you've become. You're trying to destroy me." "No," she said softly. "You did that yourself." After the call, she stood by the window watching the rain-soaked city below. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the golden glow of lights reflected on the river. She could feel the weight of freedom, the kind that costs half a lifetime to earn. Downstairs, Ethan sat on the sofa, his eyes fixed toward the stairs. He knew that in this house, every lie had finally shattered like that wine glass on the night it all began. And the mother he once thought fragile had become the strongest person he had ever known. The morning after the rain, Boston gleamed with an unusual brightness. Sunlight shimmered across the surface of the Charles River, glistening but cold. Clara stood by the window listening to the radio as the news anchor read aloud. Lena Cross, former financial assistant of Morrison Capital, has fled the United States using a fake passport. She took more than $12 million with her. Clara stayed silent, her eyes closing for a brief moment. She had expected this, yet hearing it still made her chest tighten. There was no anger left, only the quiet fatigue of someone who understood that justice sometimes arrives slowly but surely. The phone rang. Alan's voice came through. "Good news, Clara. The prosecutor's office has officially dropped the investigation. Your assets have been confirmed as fully legitimate." Clara smiled faintly, a rare gesture after so many months. "Thank you, Alan. It's finally over." Ethan came down the stairs holding his phone. "Mom, the press is surrounding Dad. Did Lena really betray him?" "Yes," she said softly. "Those who live by betrayal are always devoured by their own game." She handed him a cup of coffee, her tone gentle but firm. "Don't feel happy about it, son. There's no victory in destruction." At noon, Richard appeared at her door. Gone was the expensive suit. Instead, he wore a dark coat, his hair unkempt, eyes hollow with sleeplessness. He stood there for a long time before speaking. "Clara, I need to talk." "There's no need," she replied calmly. "Everything's already clear." "I'm not here to argue," he said, shaking his head. "Lena's gone. The investors have pulled out. The company has collapsed." "I've lost everything. You didn't lose it because of me, Richard," she said quietly. "You set your own fire." He looked down, his voice rough. "I forgot who you were. Now I remember." "You never forgot," she answered. "You just refused to face it." A long silence followed. Finally, Richard spoke again, almost pleading. "I'm sorry." "Apologies that come too late can't save anyone," she said softly, "but at least they show you still have a conscience." Then she turned away. When the door closed behind him, Clara didn't cry. Instead, she felt an unexpected lightness, as though she had finally put down a burden she'd carried for decades. That afternoon, she met with Ms. Stern, her lawyer. Stern placed a new file on the desk. "Clara, you should restructure the Aurora Foundation. After this case, you could turn it into a fund to help women who've been financially manipulated." Clara was silent for a moment, then nodded. "If I've walked through hell, I want to leave a light behind for others." That evening when she came home, Ethan was reading the news. "Mom, they're calling you the woman who rose again. Everyone admires you." Clara laughed softly. "Yesterday they criticized me, today they praise me. It doesn't matter as long as I know I did what's right." Ethan took her hand. "I'm proud of you." Clara smiled. "I'm not stronger than anyone's son. I've just learned how not to bow my head anymore." That night, Clara sat by the window gazing at the illuminated city. On her desk lay the draft for Aurora Foundation Women's Financial Rebirth Program. Beneath the title, she wrote one more line: "No one can take away the freedom of a woman who knows her own worth." She set the pen down and smiled. Outside, a soft breeze drifted past the window, carrying the faint scent of the season's last rain. At last, the battle was over, not with hatred, but with awakening. On Monday morning, mist covered Beacon Street, the city seeming freshly washed after the storm of scandal. Clara sat in a small cafe near the Charles River. Her laptop opened the screen filled with dozens of emails sent to the Aurora Foundation. Women from all over Boston, Chicago, Seattle wrote letters of gratitude, sharing stories of marriages where they had been financially controlled, of times they were forced to sign contracts they didn't understand. Clara read each line carefully, her eyes stinging, but her heart warm. When Ms. Stern, her lawyer, arrived, she took a seat across from her and handed over a new folder. "We've officially received the license for Aurora Foundation Women's Financial Rebirth Program. Congratulations, Clara." Clara nodded slightly, her voice calm and steady. "I want to start right away. No galas, no publicity. I just want to help women gain knowledge and confidence." Stern smiled. "That's why people believe in you, because you didn't turn victory into revenge." That afternoon, Clara visited Ethan at the law firm where he worked. He was preparing his first case, a complex divorce proceeding. When he saw his mother, he quickly stood. "Mom, what a surprise." "I just wanted to see if you're happy," she said, glancing around the office that still smelled of new paper. "You chose the right path, Ethan," he smiled. "You taught me that. Justice isn't for the rich, it's for those brave enough to tell the truth." Clara placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Remember, there's no winning or losing in justice, only truth." That evening, Clara returned to the house that had once been the center of the storm. Everything was quiet now. The old framed photos had been taken down, the dark red curtains replaced with soft cream ones. She walked through the living room and stopped before a photo of a young, Richard, confident smile, ambitious eyes. She sighed. If only you'd known when to stop before everything turned to ash. The phone rang, an unknown number on the screen. Richard's voice came through the speaker, low and weak. "Clara, I'm in the hospital. Heart checkup. Nothing serious, but I'd like to see you." She was silent for a long moment. Memories flooded back, the glittering dinners, his laughter when she explained financial plans, the moment he handed her the document that betrayed her. "I'll come tomorrow," she said quietly. The hospital was sterile and bright, the air heavy with disinfectant. Richard lay in bed, thinner than before, his hand trembling slightly. When he saw Clara, he managed a faint smile. "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't come for you," she said gently. "I came for the part of you that's still human." He looked at her for a long time, eyes tired. "Did you ever really love me?" Clara nodded softly. "Very much, but love can't save a man who's forgotten his morals." Richard gave a weak laugh, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Now I understand, you've won." She shook her head. "No one wins. We only learn the price of deceit. I've lost everything," he said, "but you seem happy." "Not exactly," Clara replied quietly. "I'm just at peace knowing I'm no longer afraid." A breeze swept through the hospital window. Richard looked out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you forgive me?" "No," she said after a pause. "But I won't hate you either." He closed his eyes and smiled faintly. That's enough. When Clara left the hospital, the afternoon light was fading. The trees shed golden leaves, and the wind carried a chill. She walked slowly, feeling as though she had finally closed a heavy book. Her life, once trapped in the web of betrayal, had been untangled strand by strand. That night at the small office of the Aurora Foundation, Clara looked at the new sign gleaming on the wall. No one can steal freedom from a woman who knows her worth. She placed a vase of white roses on her desk, turned on the lamp, and opened the window to let the night breeze in. Outside, Boston shone brighter than ever, as if no storm had ever touched it. And in that light, Clara Morrison smiled, knowing that every pain had transformed into strength, not just for her, but for every woman who would one day find herself through this story. The next morning, Boston awoke to its first winter after all the turmoil. There were no more reporters outside the door, no more anonymous phone calls. Clara's apartment was filled with sunlight, the soft sound of piano music drifting from the living room. On the table lay a new folder titled Aurora Foundation First Training Course for Women Victimized by Financial Manipulation. Clara walked through the quiet room, a cup of tea in her hand, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, but gratitude. After all the battles she had fought, she was finally living life on her own terms. Ethan entered carrying a stack of papers. "Mom, should I give the opening speech for you today?" "No." She smiled. "I have to be there myself. This is the day I owe to me." The ceremony was held in a modest but elegant building by the river. In front of her sat more than 30 women, some still in their office uniforms, others in simple clothes, each wearing an expression that blended fear with hope. Clara stepped up to the podium, the microphone trembling slightly in her hand. The day I discovered my husband's betrayal, she began calmly, I thought my life was over. But in truth, it was the first day I truly saw myself. I didn't create this foundation for revenge, but to help women understand that financial knowledge and self-respect are things no one can ever take away. The room fell silent. A young woman in the front row began to cry softly. Ethan stood in the corner, his eyes shining with pride. When the event ended, Clara stepped outside. The cold wind brushed against her cheeks. Miss Stern approached and handed her an envelope. Clara, the court has issued the final ruling. All assets within the Aurora Foundation are recognized as fully independent. No one has the right to contest them. Clara nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Good. Now the past is truly over. But Stern hesitated. I heard Richard sold what remained of the company. He's leaving Boston. Clara was quiet for a moment. Everyone has their own path to redemption. I hope he finds peace. That afternoon when she returned home, a sealed envelope lay at her door with no sender's name. Inside was an old photograph of her and Richard standing on the beach in Capri. On the back, written in his familiar handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for reminding me that I once had something worth cherishing." Our Clara looked at it for a long time, then placed it in a drawer. No tears, no anger, only a feeling of closure. Later that night, Ethan knocked on her door. "Mom, there's something I want you to see." He placed a new proposal on her desk, Aurora Legal Wing free legal aid program for women tricked into signing financial contracts. Clara looked at her son, moved. "You want to do this?" "Not just want to. I have to. You taught me that justice doesn't live in a courtroom. It lives in the hands of those who dare to act." She smiled through misty eyes. "Ethan, you are the best part of everything I've ever had." Outside the window, snow began to fall, small white flakes glowing under the golden streetlights. Clara gazed out and said softly, "Every time the first snow falls, I feel like I get to start over." Ethan looked up. "Start over with what, Mom? Start living this time for myself." After Ethan left, Clara stayed at her desk and opened her laptop. She began typing the opening lines for the Aurora Foundation website. I was not born to be controlled, silenced, or deceived into signing away my worth. I was born to understand my value and to protect it. If you're reading this, you can do the same. She pressed save and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the snow thickened, turning the world beyond her window into white. In the quiet, Clara felt an unfamiliar peace settle deep inside her. She knew her journey wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. 3 weeks later, Boston was buried in snow. The city was white and silent, so quiet one could hear the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. In the small office of the Aurora Foundation, Clara sat by the window, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating her calm but resolute face. On the table lay dozens of new folders letters from women across the country, asking for advice, for knowledge, for a chance to begin again. Alan Pierce walked in, holding a cup of hot coffee. "You're still working. It's past 9. Clara smiled faintly. When someone has once lost their freedom, they learn to treasure every second of it once it's regained. Alan sat across from her, glancing at the piles of paperwork. You've turned your personal battle into a refuge for hundreds of others. You know, not everyone could do that. No, Clara replied softly. I just don't want anyone else to experience the humiliation I once did. The door opened. Ethan entered, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Mom, you need to go home and rest. I already sent all the documents to the lawyer and the course tomorrow already," he said, smiling. "I'll teach the first class. You just need to come and give the opening speech." Clara nodded gently, pride and emotion blending in her eyes. The next morning, the first class officially began. The room was simple, with a banner on the wall reading, "Financial independence is emotional freedom." On the tables were stacks of printed materials and a few old laptops donated by volunteers. The women sat in a circle, some newly divorced, some who had lost their homes, others still trembling as they signed their names. When Clara entered the room, rose to applaud. She smiled, her voice steady and warm. "I'm not here to teach you how to seek revenge. I'm here to teach you how to rise again. Freedom doesn't come from leaving someone. It comes from realizing you deserve more." A middle-aged woman in the front raised her hand, her voice shaking. "If my husband still controls all the finances, how can I protect myself?" Clara looked at her and answered slowly, "Start with knowledge. A signature can bind you, but a legal document can also set you free. Learn to read every term before you trust a promise." Ethan watched his mother, admiration filling his eyes. He remembered the nights he'd heard her cry quietly, the days she looked fragile. But now she stood before the class, her voice steady as the wind. After the session, Clara stepped onto the balcony overlooking the snowy city. Alan followed silent for a moment before asking, "Have you ever thought about writing your story?" "Who would want to read it?" she asked. "Everyone who needs a reason to believe in themselves," he replied. Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe someday, when I'm brave enough to look back at every scar." That evening back home, she found an envelope on her doorstep. No sender's name. Inside was an old photograph of her and Richard on the beach in Capri. On the back, in familiar handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for reminding me that I once had something worth cherishing. R." Clara read it slowly, her hands trembling slightly. There was no anger, no resentment, only a quiet sorrow. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the old photo. At least she whispered he found his way home. That night, Boston was still and calm. Snow fell outside the window, blanketing the balcony, the rooftops, and the dark corners that had once lived in Clara's heart. She sat at her laptop, opened the Aurora Foundation website, and wrote a new message. "You cannot change another person, but you can change your future. Learn, understand, and protect yourself. Every right decision brings you one step closer to freedom." When the final words appeared on the screen, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The ticking clock and the sound of wind outside filled the quiet room. Inside her, a deep peace began to spread, as if finally everything had fallen into its rightful place. Clara was no longer the betrayed wife, no longer the woman living in someone else's shadow. She was the author of her own story, written not with tears, but with knowledge, courage, and a promise that no woman should ever be silenced again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, veiling the city in white. But in Clara's heart, this winter was the first season of her rebirth. One February morning, the sky over Boston was clear as crystal. The city felt unusually peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the year before. Clara stepped out of the Aurora Foundation building, her silk scarf fluttering in the cold breeze. In front of her, dozens of women gathered by the gate, laughing, hugging, celebrating, after graduating from the first course on financial independence. They had once arrived with weary eyes, but now their faces glowed with confidence. Clara stood quietly watching them as if seeing her own reflection from years ago, a woman who once doubted she was strong enough to start over. A middle-aged woman approached, tears glistening in her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison," she said softly, I just wanted to thank you. If it weren't for this course, I would have signed the divorce papers without knowing my rights. Now I've kept the house for my children." Clara embraced her gently. "No one gave that to you," she said warmly. "You fought for it yourself." When the ceremony ended, Ethan came over handing his mother the morning paper. On the front page was Clara's photo under a bold headline, "The Woman Who Turned Betrayal into a National Movement." Clara skimmed it and smiled. The media always loves a dramatic story. "I just did what anyone should do, Ethan. What you call ordinary changed thousands of lives," he said quietly. "Don't you see that?" Clara looked at him, her eyes gentle but deep. "If anyone changed things, it was you. You reminded me to believe in justice when I thought it was just an illusion." That afternoon, she met with the Foundation's board. Alan presented plans to expand Aurora Foundation to New York and Chicago. The number of counseling requests has tripled. We'll need a larger legal team. Clara nodded, her tone steady but calm. "We won't expand with money, but with integrity. We'll only reach where we're truly needed." When the meeting ended, Alan lingered. "Clara, there's something you should know. Richard's been discharged from the hospital. He sold off what remained of his assets and left Boston. He's living in a small seaside town in Maine." Clara paused. "Did he say anything?" "Only that he wants to live the rest of his life quietly without hurting anyone anymore." She nodded. That's the best thing he could do. That evening, Clara returned home late. The apartment was still warm and tidy, filled with soft light. Ethan was cooking in the kitchen, the scent of pasta filling the air. "Mom, you're back. I have good news. The Aurora Legal Wing just received its independent operating license. We'll start reviewing the first 30 cases next week." Clara smiled, sitting down and slipping off her old ring. "You make me proud, Ethan. You're continuing what I started, but taking it even further." They had dinner together, talking about work and the women they had helped. Midway through the meal, Ethan hesitated. "Mom, if Dad reaches out again, would you see him?" Clara set down her knife, thinking for a moment. Maybe. Not to forgive him, but to close the chapter. The next morning, a handwritten letter arrived sent from Maine. The handwriting was familiar Richard's. In it, he invited her to the small coastal town where he lived, saying he wanted one final conversation before winter ends. Clara finished reading, her heart calm, touched not by turmoil but by quiet understanding. She decided to go telling no one. The seaside town was small and still, with white wooden houses lining the bay and snow covering the rooftops. Richard greeted her at a cafe. His face was older, his hair gray, his eyes unexpectedly gentle. He smiled faintly. "I didn't think you'd come." "Neither did I," Clara said, sitting down. "But I realized that hatred is just another chain. I don't want to be bound anymore." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the waves crashing in the distance. Finally, Richard spoke. "I've been following the Aurora Foundation. What you've done is extraordinary. You made me realize that true worth isn't found in power, but in self-respect." "I didn't do it to prove anything to you," Clara replied softly. "I did it for the women who once were like me, but thank you for at least understanding that." Richard bowed his head. "If there's another life, I hope I can start over, not to be your husband, but to learn from you how to be a better man." Clara smiled gently, her expression so kind it made him look away. "You don't need another life. Just live the rest of this one with decency. That's enough." Before leaving, Richard handed her an envelope. "I rewrote the founding papers of our old company, naming you as the official co-founder. The company may be worthless now, but I wanted the truth to be recorded." Clara accepted it and nodded. "Thank you, Richard. Not for the paper, but for finally being honest." On the train ride back to Boston, the wind howled against the glass, blowing swirls of snow past the window. Clara gazed outside, feeling every weight she'd carried slowly melt away. She smiled softly and whispered, "At last the past is at peace." When the train pulled into the station, her phone buzzed a message from Ethan. "Mom, my TV interview is tonight. They want to talk about Aurora's next generation." Clara read it, her eyes misting. She replied, "You are Aurora's true future. I'm so proud of you." That night, as Boston lit up beneath the winter sky, Clara sat by the window sipping her tea, her gaze distant and calm. In the quiet darkness, the image of Richard faded, replaced by the faces of the women she had helped. She no longer felt alone. Her story had become theirs, and that was the legacy that truly mattered. The winter wind brushed against the window pane, carrying a crisp chill. Clara closed her notebook and wrote the final line in her journal. "I lost a husband but found myself. I lost a home but created hundreds for others. And at last I understand forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's no longer hurting when you remember." 3 months later, spring returned to Boston. The city began to warm, and the trees along the Charles River sprouted tender green leaves that shimmered under the sunlight. Inside the modest building of the Aurora Foundation, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. On the wall hung a large photograph from the foundation's first graduation ceremony, dozens of women standing hand in hand with Clara at the center, her gentle smile radiating quiet strength. That morning, Clara was reviewing the foundation's expansion plans when Ethan entered, his face glowing. "Mom, I just got invited for a national TV interview. They want me to talk about Aurora and about you." She looked up, half smiling, half uneasy. "My story has been told enough, Ethan. This is your time now." "No, Ethan," said, his eyes bright. "There wouldn't be an Aurora without you. You're the first spark." Clara looked at her son, pride and emotion welling up inside her. "Then talk about what truly matters, Ethan. Not betrayal, not money, but freedom." That afternoon they went together to the studio. Bright white lights filled the stage, and before the cameras rolled, the director whispered to Ethan, "When the show ends, invite your mother up. Her story deserves to be told in her own voice." Ethan nodded, glancing back at Clara, who sat calmly in the front row, dressed in a soft pearl-colored suit, her composure unshakable. The interview began. Ethan spoke about his mother's journey from a woman who once lived in the shadow of her wealthy husband to the moment she uncovered his betrayal to founding the Aurora Foundation and giving women back their voices after financial control had silenced them. With each word, the audience grew quieter. Near the end, his voice slowed, carrying both reverence and love. "The person who taught me that justice isn't found in a courtroom, but in one's heart, is my mother." The lights shifted, falling on Clara. The room erupted in applause. For a moment she froze, then stood and walked toward the stage. Ethan handed her the microphone. Clara looked around, her voice steady and warm. "I'm not here to retell my tragedy. I'm here to remind everyone that every woman has the right to rewrite her own story. We don't need miracles, just the courage to say enough." A woman in the audience began to cry, and the room fell utterly silent. Clara continued, "I once thought forgiveness was weakness, but in truth, forgiveness is courage, because only those strong enough can truly let go. I lost everything I thought was mine, yet I found something greater peace." The applause was long and thunderous, echoing even after the program ended. As the crowd dispersed, the host asked softly, "Mrs. Morrison, do you have one final message for our viewers?" Clara smiled gently. "Just one. If you're afraid, remember silence is a choice, but it never saves anyone." That night when she returned home, she turned on the TV. The image of her and Ethan filled the national broadcast. Social media exploded with gratitude, comments and messages from women across the country, women who had been ignored, single mothers, wives searching for escape. They wrote to Aurora sharing their stories. Clara read every message, tears falling without her knowing whether they came from sadness or joy. Then the phone rang. It was the hospital in Maine. A nurse's gentle voice spoke Mrs. Morrison. Mr. Richard Morrison passed away last night. Before he died, he left an envelope for you. Clara gripped the phone, her heart tightening not from love, but from memory. The next day, the parcel arrived. Inside was a worn leather notebook and a single note. I have nothing left to give but gratitude. You saved me from myself. R. She sat quietly for a long while, then whispered, You've found your peace, Richard. Thank you for finally understanding. She placed the notebook in a drawer beside the old photo from Capri, closing the past once more. That afternoon, Ethan came to see her and noticed her red eyes. Are you okay, Mom? I am, she said softly, smiling. I was just thinking sometimes forgiveness that comes late is still a blessing. Mother and son stood by the window watching the golden light spill over the city. Across the river, a small sailboat drifted on the calm water glowing under the setting sun. Clara took Ethan's hand and said gently, Ethan, life always balances its debts and payments. What matters is that we leave it with peace in our hearts. He nodded. You've already done that, Mom. When night fell, Clara opened her computer and added a new line to the Aurora Foundation homepage, dedicated to Richard Morrison, who taught me that even darkness can create light if we have the courage to walk through it. Outside, the spring wind rustled through the trees, carrying the soft scent of new beginnings. In Clara's heart, there was no past, no resentment, only the quiet light of a woman who had finally come home to herself. On a bright summer morning, Boston was drenched in sunlight. The central square was packed with people. In the main hall, a large silver sign gleamed, Aurora Center for Women's Independence. The newest branch of the foundation Clara had built, now expanded nationwide. Flags fluttered in the wind, the scene glowing like the opening of a new chapter. Clara stepped onto the podium. Her light blue dress made her look younger, her face radiant, her eyes calm with the quiet strength of someone who had walked through storms. Ethan sat in the front row, his gaze filled with pride. Her voice was steady and warm. 2 years ago, I was a woman sitting alone in an empty house facing a divorce paper and betrayal. I thought I had lost everything, but I learned that the one thing no one can ever steal is self-respect. From that moment, Aurora was born not out of revenge, but out of awakening. The applause was long and heartfelt. Clara continued, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. I didn't create this foundation to retell my tragedy, but to remind every woman that we all have the right to rewrite our own story. Turn your wounds into light. She looked down at the first row. The women who once came to her in despair were now advisors, accountants, lawyers. Each carried the same light in their eyes, the light of dawn, just like the name of the foundation, Aurora. After the ceremony, a reporter approached her. Do you have any regrets, he asked, about losing your husband and your old life? Clara smiled softly. I didn't lose a husband. I found myself. That afternoon, she sat in her new office writing a letter to the women who would join the upcoming training program. If you're reading this, it might mean you're afraid. I once was too. But I learned that freedom is not something others give you. It's something you reclaim. Once you understand your worth, no one can make you feel small again. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a wooden box, a message for the next generation. Later that day, Ethan brought in an envelope. Mom, the national network invited you to join a special broadcast, Women Who Changed America. Clara laughed. That sounds far too grand. Ethan took her hand. No, Mom. You've changed thousands of lives, including mine. Night fell and the city lights glimmered. Clara stood by the window of her old apartment, the same place that had once witnessed all her tears. Now the walls glowed warmly, no longer holding pain. On her desk lay her old journal. She opened it and read the last line written the year before, "Forgiveness is freedom." Picking up her pen, she added, "And freedom is the beginning of love, love for oneself." Suddenly the phone rang. It was Miss Stern, her lawyer, her voice trembling with emotion. "Clara, have you heard the Supreme Court just passed the new Equal Financial Rights in Marriage Act, and they quoted your speech in their ruling?" Clara froze. They did, yes. Aurora isn't just a foundation anymore, it's a symbol. Clara placed her hand over her heart, feeling its tremor. It wasn't the thrill of victory, but the deep realization that her journey had grown beyond any personal redemption. Late that night, Ethan came home to find his mother still awake, her eyes shining. "Mom, you're not asleep yet?" "No," she said softly. "I was just thinking if I had signed that paper back then, none of this would exist." Ethan smiled. "Maybe you had to be betrayed to realize how strong you really are." They both laughed, the sound light as a breath. Outside, the summer wind carried the faint scent of salt from the Charles River. Clara said gently, "You know, I used to think I'd lost. But really, winning or losing doesn't matter. What matters is keeping your kindness." Ethan nodded. "You never lost that, Mom." When the clock struck midnight, Clara stepped out onto the balcony. The city slept beneath a soft golden glow, tender and still. She took a deep breath, feeling the warm breeze brush against her skin, the scent of jasmine floating in the air. At last she whispered, "Thank you, betrayals, because without you I would never have found myself." She went back inside and opened her laptop. On the homepage of the Aurora Foundation, she added one final message. "If this story makes you look within yourself, leave it wherever you are, because the light does not belong to me. It belongs to everyone who has walked through darkness and chosen to rise." Clara Morrison pressed publish. The glow from the screen reflected across her face, the face of a woman who had once fallen, once been betrayed, but had now become a symbol of freedom, courage, and compassion. Outside, the summer wind rustled through the trees, the leaves whispering like a soft congratulation. And somewhere in the quiet night, a familiar voice seemed to echo, "You've won, Clara." She smiled gently and whispered back, "No, Richard. I didn't win. I just came back to life."